Okay, so I decided when Jane invited me to be part of this, I decided I wanted to do something different. Now, there's a lot of noise going around. It seems that there's too much noise going around and we can get lost in a sea of information. So the first thing I tried to say is, well, what has been my journey? And what I want to change today is my journey has to become our journey. I want to invite you to reflect on some things that I've been facing, and you'll figure out that you and I are not so different. My focus is always about the social component of the supply chain. It's important for us to understand what got us here, what built it, and what made us going into the future. So first thing I would see, well, if we're discussing about a supply chain, that it means that there's a consumer, and there's a customer at the end, and there's a person at the beginning. So how do we understand their behavioral patterns? There's a lot of changes in how we are actually buying. It's not, as many have mentioned, it's not so much about the e-commerce and just having endless catalogs and having an endless shelf space. People surf the internet, and not always are they looking to buy something. Only 19% of the people that are surfing the web are actually going after a purchase that they have in mind. So, well, what does that translate into? Well, one of the first things we have to notice is what are we doing as retailers, as brands and as companies to address it? Well, one of the things that consumers are telling us is, well, what do I look for in the experience? And one of the things that I'm looking for is for the brand to create the experience. And I'm willing to tell you how to improve that experience. And when you cross that, well, this one is actually one of two things. So it's in order to get that information, I'm willing to share what I'm looking for. I'm willing to tell you gender, age, and the only thing I'm not so keen to tell you is because of all of the hype around it, I'm not so keen to let you in on where I am at all times. In unison with, well, what's the top priority for the business? It's improving the customer experience. So when both of those objectives are aligned, it seems that the customer wants a better experience, and our main focus is to create a better customer experience. So we have to utilize the tech in order to meet and make those two match. So in a world with which can be reduced to zeros and ones if we wanted to, which I don't agree, but we can. If we look into the data set of the world, we can reduce it to zeros and ones. We can use tech for several reasons. One of them is problem capturing, is there's too much information for us to manage. Then is how do we process all of that information? Then how do we execute on all of that? And I think it's part of what we've been discussing. It's all of these tools and resources are available, but now what do we do with all of this information? And once we reach that, how do we scale that into a sustainable solution in the long term? And at the end, what we need to remember is that tech is here to simplify. And the way we do that is by prioritizing, tracing our document, understanding the information that's been received, and replicating it. Once we've finished that initial cycle, then we can go into innovation because we know where we stand. If we try to innovate, or if we try to arrange the last mile, well, what happens to the rest of the supply chain? In some cases, the infrastructure is not there to make that happen. So we need to prioritize, and we need to scale it on maybe on a linear path or on an ecosystem, but it needs to be traceable. Then we can amplify it, and once we're there, then the cycle can be repeated. If I go back to my initial assignment when I arrived in Asia, I was asked to do a 5-year roadmap. So my 5-year roadmap is obsolete. If I look at it now, I could probably say, well, that's no longer 10% of what the company needs. So we restructured into a 3-year cycle, and those 3-year cycles have been actually happening in more or less about 1.5 to 2 years. So even though the objectives are there, just the timeline has been more constrained. So going back to the purpose of this research is, well, for my part, one of the most important aspects of all of the supply chain is a person. So when we're defining a social equation, or in the social equation, we are the data. There's really nothing that is going to substitute the power of a handshake. When you have a problem, you want someone to pick up the phone. You don't want to send an email and expect things to be solved. You want someone to give you the certainty, and we have to recognize ourselves as an entity in the supply chain. So what's working now? And the first thing that came to mind, well, it's actually all of you. And the reason I'm able to make that is that, well, we have two ways of looking at it. It's what it's called and what it actually is. So even though we call it a task-centric operation, what it really is just people showing up to work. And when we start discussing about on-site management, risk management, it's having people we trust going out and doing the work and doing the road work and the lead work and visiting the suppliers and visiting the factories and making sure that things are compliant. When we discuss about influencer and key opinion leader marketing, we have to be in line with what the customers is wanting, because not only are they telling us what they want, they're creating their own content, and finally it's about sustainability. And sustainability is just about us looking back and saying, well, what are we leaving behind? For all of this to happen, well, there's really one central objective is we're all just looking to connect. So this is what's worked for me. And one of the first things, or the main message behind all of this would be maybe beware of the buzzword. Now, so when we are in a shared market economy, then we run into this situation of my machine is better than yours. And when that happens, we have to kind of turn back and say, well, if the information is the same for everyone, and we all have access to the technology, then couldn't we all come to the same conclusions? And the answer is yes. So the risk there is, well, what's keeping us from becoming identical, and haven't we done so already? To my point, I don't think so exactly. And one of the reasons is because every single one of you contributes and analyzes data in a different manner. Every one of us represents a different market. We all look at things from a different angle. So that's why new theories come up and new innovations come up. There's a lot of people that speak about personalization. So for me, it's not about self-branding. It's about personal representation. What I mean by that is I'm not trying to promote something I'm not. It's just that when I try to put my name on something, I want it to represent what I really am. The other thing that I would have wished that I knew is to interpret the true meaning of bespoke. We spoke a lot about catering to the one customer. So in addition, and I was caught from what Lynn was mentioning is, of course, you have to observe the signs. And one of the things that the signs are telling is stay in your lane. Not all of us can do the exact same thing. Not all the factories are good for everyone. I share a market with one of our good friends here, and it's a completely different sourcing strategy because we have a different consumer in mind. Staying in your lane and understanding what your customer wants and what your company is after, I think it's one of the main risks that we have. So if you've heard me speak in the past, I always throw my daughters into the mix. And one of the things that I wish I would have known a bit before is that from how they learn, I've learned to manage my team. So what I looked at is, well, how does a 4-year-old learn? She tests the limits, and my limits, and she pushes to see how far the system is willing to go. So that's kind of where we do, how fast can we become? How much lower can we do? Where can we leverage the cost? How can we cut those corners without compromising? When do we ask our factories to do too much? And when we start asking them to do too much, well, they're going to cut some things that maybe I'm not so comfortable doing. So we have to test that limit and see where that line is. The second one is trial and error. We have to be out there. And in order to create change, someone has to go first. And we may not scale it across the board, but we have to try it, and we do those test orders, and that's how we find the new sourcing hubs and the new manufacturing, the new system. We have to test the limit, and tech speed favors the bold. The more out there you are, the more you're going to be able to capitalize from new technologies. Not all of it's going to work, but at least you're going to be at the front line when those discussions come up. And finally, you have to ask questions. You have to ask a lot of questions. I think to one of the points discussed today is there's a lot of information that vendors have and that suppliers have and that factories have. Now, how do we bring that into the conversation to make that a tangible asset? If they're the experts in manufacturing and the designers don't know what to do with new fabrics, well, then we have to teach them how to manage that. Well, the next part is I would have liked to clarify my focus, in which I would have to define the best in class. And best in class doesn't mean the same for everyone. Some people need to be quicker. Some people need to be finer. Some people just need to create a better experience. And in some cases, it just needs to be boxed, and it has to be practical and convenient. And the next thing for us in particular is consolidation even a thing? And haven't we always done it? No? The third one is that nearshoring doesn't necessarily speed things up, it just gives us alternatives. What we try to get is the best alternative in the shortest amount of time, if that's what our customer is valuing. If we have time, then nearshoring doesn't become as attractive as it should be, and maybe we can leverage the volume elsewhere. So it's more about understanding that balance of where we land. And finally, the new sourcing territories are not for everyone. No, there's a lot of hype about what's the up and coming, and for example, out of maybe 3 or 4 countries that I've visited, we're not there yet. At least my business is not there yet. I don't have the volume to scale into Myanmar because I can't do full container loading, and the infrastructure doesn't support loose cargo and LCL. So I have to step out. I know there's opportunities, but I don't have the volume to do it. And a volume of that nature can compete in Cambodia, and Vietnam, or Bangladesh. So is it really worth it for me to go to the hassle of transferring out of one of the kind of tried and true markets in order to save on the 5 cents? No. So if it comes down to 5 cents, I'm going to choose reliability every single time. No. Finally, we also discuss about change management, which is we need to stop trying to control the chaos. No, and we just have to work into an advantage. And also, what got you here won't get us there, and isolation is obsolete. Those kind of personal-driven career paths in which it's my way and kicking everyone out of the way doesn't really work. And you have to avoid the pendulum effect. Every time we try something, it just seems like we go way too much in the other direction. Then we're trying to scale it back, and when we try to scale back, we go way in the other direction. So it's difficult to create kind of that cadence. And we have to be careful, because if it slows down too much, then we come to a halt, and that's even worse than being on the far end. So there's a specific point in the pendulum in which it just kind of scales back and forth at a reasonable pace, and it's that pace that we need to find in each one of our markets. So what's been constant in all of this? So by the end of this, what I found is that there's always a person, there's going to be an expectation, and we're going to solve it with a product. As long as we have these 3 key components, or as long as these 3 components have been present, it doesn't really matter what the market looks like. We're always going to have these 3 players within it. So with that in mind, what I would like to leave you with is that don't forget about me. And I don't mean me in particular, you can forget about me, but don't forget about the message, which is there's always a person at the end and at the beginning. There's someone that manufactures it, someone that reads the data. There's a creative mind behind everything that we're trying to do. And there's a person that wants to walk into our stores. There's a person that wants to interact with our user experience. So we went from the buyer to the consumer to the user experience, and now we're going into the sensory experience. So how do we start to capitalize on what the psychological aspect of our consumer is wanting, and how do we not take advantage, but how do we use that to make it better? And I will leave you with my signature idea, which is before you try to do anything, always remember to humanize before you digitize. Thank you so much for listening.